So, as we've seen, Thrasymachus has this really radical and unsettling claim about justice. And I think you could generalize what he says about justice to what he would say about morality more generally, right? It's a system of control that allows the powerful, the strong, whoever's in charge to control everyone else in society for their benefit, the benefit of the strong, being the people in charge, at the expense of everybody else. This is not, of course, what Socrates thinks justice is. He thinks justice is important, he thinks it's good. Well, he can't just say this. He can't, that's not a very convincing reply in a debate. If one guy says, well, A, and the other guy says, well, obviously not A, you're not getting anywhere, right? So Socrates needs a response, and I think he develops a pretty powerful one. It takes a little bit of work to see what this is, though, right? I think a bit of this gets buried in the details of the dialogue, so we're going to have to pull it out just a little bit. So let's do that. So remember, let's keep Thrasymachus' account of justice in mind. Just a system of rules set up by those in charge to benefit themselves. Well, Socrates' first response, or the first part of his response, because I think this leads into the rest of it, is to say to Thrasymachus, your account leads to a contradiction. He says, okay, well, why is that? Well, he puts this in slightly different words, but he says, okay, Thrasymachus, you think that justice equals doing what is in the interest of those in charge. And Thrasymachus says, yeah, obviously I've said that, Socrates. You also think justice is doing what those in charge command you to do. Thrasymachus says, yeah, I think that as well, right? Well, then he says, but sometimes those who are in charge, the strong as you have it, the people in charge of society, are wrong about what's in their interest. And there we run into a contradiction, because it seems if you do what those who are in charge tell you to, you act against their interests. So it's just but also unjust. But, you do what they tell you, it's not in their interest, so it's just because you do what they tell you, but it's unjust because it's not in their interest. Seems like you get a contradiction either way. And you might think that, okay, Socrates, you're just being clever here, you're playing with words. Thrasymachus accuses him of this a lot. You're just throwing out these little debaters' tricks. I don't care. He's more insulting about this, right? But I think that there is something to this if we dig into it. And it helps, again, to throw out some real-world examples. Think about the Nazis, right? I mean, I hate to resort to the Nazis because, there's a joke on the internet that every debate ends up people bringing up the Nazis. But the Nazis are, in moral debates, good examples because, God, everyone knows they're wrong, right? Hopefully, right? I had one student one time who was an actual Nazi sympathizer, God help us. But out of hundreds, perhaps thousands of students, one guy, So pretty much everybody, right? So they're a good example. I hate to do it, I will fall back on the Nazis a few other times. But back to the point. Think about Nazi policies, right? Germany pre-World War II, Germany in the early days of the 20th century had some of the greatest scientists in the world, possibly the greatest scientists in the world. But many of them were Jewish. And the Nazi policies led these Jewish scientists like Einstein to flee. And not only did the Nazis make their best scientists flee, and they fled to places like America and Britain that would later fight a war with the Nazis, but, they were even biased against non-Jewish German scientists who were too close to Jewish scientists. Heisenberg, one of their probably their best physicist left after Einstein left, they kind of sidelined him because they said, oh, well, you're not Jewish, but you do Jewish physics because you're too close to these Jewish physicists, right? Well, if you're trying to fight a war, it is not in your interest if you have lost your best scientists, right? There are a lot of reasons that America developed the atomic bomb and the Nazis didn't, but Nazi policies that made their best scientists flee are a good part of it, right? Obviously, this is not in their interest, right? Losing a war after which you get hanged, many of the Nazis were, it's not in your interest. I mean, we can debate, and we will debate what is in people's interests, ending up in the dock at Nuremberg and then with a noose around your neck, not in anybody's interest. I don't know any account of self-interest that would say it is, right? There's all kinds of stupid Nazi policies that weren't just morally terrible, but actually were counterproductive in them even winning the war. But the example of the physicist is a really prominent one. Not only did they not have these guys later worked for the Americans, worked for us, helped us build the bomb, which if the war had continued, we would have dropped on Germany, right? That was the initial plan. Or to take a less radical example, but still pretty radical, you can look at the Jim Crow system that the South imposed after the Civil War, the system of segregation. It was obviously terrible for African Americans, but it also left the South poor and backward. It was an economically bad system. You look at early 20th century America, there are no huge businesses or almost none that were headquartered in the South, right? Sears, the huge retailer, Northern business. Kodak, the film company that was huge. All of these companies, the North was much richer, and it was because the Jim Crow system was a bad economic system. You keep a huge proportion of the population poor, you don't let them be educated, that's terrible, right? You make it really uncomfortable for them to shop in local businesses. Well, guess what? They're going to go and order stuff from Sears because they don't want to deal with you, right? The people in charge, the rich white people in the Jim Crow South, were a lot poorer than their northern counterparts. And a lot of that reason was the system of segregation. Treating a huge percentage of your population badly is not a great system for economic success, right? There's actually a really good book on this by this guy, Wright. And he'll point out that after, the Jim Crow system was ended in the 60s, economic development in the South took off. Everybody ended up better off than they were. Black people and white people. The rich people, the people in charge of this society, were worse off because they put this system in place. Again, they want to be richer. We're assuming, not a stupid assumption, by putting this system in place, they are not pursuing their own interests. But this leads to a deeper point, because this can look just kind of verbal, but I think this deeper point, and one that Socrates is going to exploit, is that bad systems of justice harm even those they are set up to benefit. Socrates will not deny that what Thrasymachus has in mind sometimes happens. The powerful set things up to benefit themselves, but he will say in those systems, the powerful end up harming themselves. They are not truly acting in their own interest. Now, there's We'll talk about how Socrates' reply works in the next lecture, but a lot of this turns on this idea that justice is a craft, which Thrasymachus also admits. And this too can look, simply verbal, okay, more debating tricks, but I think there's a lot to this, there's a lot going on here, and we'll get into that in the next lecture.